Good morning, everybody. I think we'll get started now. Thank you all for coming. Great to see everybody. So this morning I'll be talking about and reading from a book that I'm currently writing about the ongoing environmental problems with a former rocket testing and nuclear research site in Southern California. And that happens to be where I grew up. And I'll also be talking about why it matters to me, why it continues to matter. Just for the record, most of the site is currently owned by the Boeing Company, and with smaller portions owned by NASA and the United States Department of Energy. The book is still very, very much a work in progress with a lot of unanswered questions, and so is this talk. So please, if you want me to clarify anything, please feel free to, during the talk, ask a question, maybe save more general questions for the end, but I'm happy to be interrupted. So I taught writing 101, freshman comp, whatever you want to call it, at Gordon College in the late 1990s. And one day, I gave them the assignment, which is kind of a common assignment for writing teachers, to say, what do you remember of the Challenger explosion? Where were you? What were your emotions? What do you remember seeing, feeling, and so on? It's just a great way to get beginning writers to think about, telling details. So that was it was probably one of the best class sessions we ever had, because it was so, everybody remembered it. I told the international students, feel free to swap in something, from your country that was like that, but every single one of them also remembered the Challenger explosion. So such granular detail they came up with, and it was also very clear that it tapped into their emotions in a way that, really resulted in some good writing. Because it happened so publicly. Millions of people saw it on TV. I'm sure you remember seeing it on TV, the horrible, the vapor trail or whatever it was, and wondering what had happened. Because it was so public, a whole lot of attention was given to it afterwards. There were autopsies, as it were, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. And does anyone know what went wrong with the Challenger?
Yes.
O-rings, yeah, which are basically it was a plumbing problem, basically. It was O-rings, which are a kind of gasket, and I forget what they connect to, but at any rate, they failed because, and this is Florida, mind you, because it was below freezing or around freezing, which was way too cold for this kind of liftoff. But they were in a hurry and figured everything would be fine. So, but the point here is that we knew about it. Oddly, I remembered not too long ago that there had been another NASA shuttle disaster in 2003, and that was the Columbia, which had instantly killed the exact same number of astronauts as the Challenger, and yet I barely remembered it even as a news item. So this led me to the question, one that's also a central question of this book. Why do we remember some events of national importance and not others? And what can happen down the road when we don't know about these events? So I posted an informal quiz on Facebook, and you all have a copy of it. Good one. But what I'd like you to do is, anybody need one who hasn't got it? So I actually, I posted this on Facebook, and I'd love to have you all look at it and tell me which ones do you remember as kind of a flashbulb moment. It happened very suddenly, so you remember exactly where you were and what you saw, heard, felt, and so on. Then which ones do you know as a news item? You knew about it after the fact, and at least you knew about it as a news event. Yes?
I can do one. You want to do it now?
Yes, I was going to ask you to,
The first one, 9/11.
9/11, yeah.
I was in my classroom. This was in knocked at the door, and a student came in and looked around and found me in the back of the room and gave me a note. And basically the note said, and it was from the principal, there has been a terrorist attack in New York. All the televisions are covering it, but do not say anything to the students until the end of the period when there will be an announcement. I didn't even have a TV in the room, so even if I wanted to, I wouldn't have.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, once the announcement was made, of course, everybody wanted to know more. I, on the other hand, was just the opposite. I didn't want to see the images on the screen. I didn't want to talk about it. It was, and we were dismissed half day because of this. I resisted looking at the television until later in the night, and then I couldn't stop looking at it.
Of course. Yeah. Anybody else have a comment about an event?
Well, the Kennedy one, I think everybody meant what?
Everybody of a certain age.
Yeah, a certain age.
Yeah. Any others that are?
I remember the Challenger well because I was in 8th grade and we were at orchestra rehearsal. And so we were playing and there was an announcement came over the last years and the only thing we heard was blew up in the ocean. And this was very much like, I was very much, in elementary school during Cold War. Like apparently as a kid, I was very, very anxious about nuclear war. So all we heard was blew up in the ocean and I immediately thought, oh my gosh, Russia bombed us, but it missed. Like, so that was because we didn't have enough information yet, because that's all the versions we've been playing. So that certainly was a dramatic thing. And then, then we spent the rest of the day in like the home economics room, which had a TV because we all just, the TV.
Bill.
So one thing that's different about January 6th is that there was, in a sense, warning that something was happening. And so it was like watching a slow motion train wreck.
Yes.
And not only was it televised, but there was the whole process of going from one horrible thing to another, which I think made it different than all of a sudden planes, coming crashing into the World Trade Center. Now, I mean, then Pennsylvania as well, but the kind of drawn out character of that disaster, I think is important to note.
Yeah, that makes a difference. Some things are an explosion and you're watching it on TV, and some things you might be watching it on TV, but it happens slowly. Are there any events on here that are completely unfamiliar to you, that you don't even remember as a news item? Yeah. Which one?
The sodium reactor?
Yeah, sodium reactor. Has anybody heard of that? Okay.
Where was it?
Well, we'll talk about it. It happened in 1959, so this is sort of a Cold War story. And with my Facebook quiz, and I think, Amy, you must have answered the question on Facebook because I recognized what you were saying. So the only one that people on Facebook didn't know about was the sodium reactor experiment, which I'm going to talk about. I slipped it in because this little-known disaster has nagged at me ever since I found out about it a few years ago. I found out about it, I can't remember exactly how, but it was just one of those random internet searches, and I said, whoa, there's a missing piece to my story here. I want to know more about this. And what happened was that in July of 1959, and that was the year I started kindergarten, an experimental nuclear reactor had a fuel meltdown just 20-some miles southeast of Pleasant Valley Elementary School and about 30 miles from downtown Los Angeles. By expert estimates, it released hundreds of times, actually, more radioactive iodine than 3 Mile Island, which happened in April of 1986. But in the case of the sodium reactor experiment, only a handful of people saw it firsthand, and they were all sworn to secrecy. At this time, there's only one living eyewitness, and he held the secret for decades before speaking out. The accident happened in what turned out to be an unfortunate place, a rocky plateau on the top of a sandstone mountain, collectively known as the Simi Hills. Now you have to picture just incredibly rugged, beautiful rock formations. Westerns were shot here. It's just a beautiful, beautiful place. So there's this plateau in the middle of towering sandstone rock formations, and that's where this lab was located.
What was the company that was in charge of it?
Pardon?
What was the company in charge of it?
It was, I'll get to that, yeah. So it was known to its employees as the Hill and to the public as Rocketdyne. So this goes way back to the 50s. It's owned by Boeing now. So it's the Hill's official name was and still is the Santa Susana Field Lab. A field lab being a place where you can conduct experiments away from population centers. And at the time, it was away from population centers. It was a rocket engine and nuclear reactor testing facility established post-World War II for experimental work too dangerous to conduct near a population center. The lab was and is still reachable only by two winding, no-shoulder roads, mountain roads, Black Canyon Road and Woolsey Canyon Road. Remember that name, Woolsey Canyon, Woolsey. It was and still is divided into four parts, pardon me. I wish I had a map with you. I didn't quite get the PowerPoint part of this talk together, but 4 areas. Areas 1, 2, and 3 were where rocket engines for just about every major U.S. space program were tested. From the first Mercury flights to the Apollo moon landing to the space shuttle fleet. So a lot of really impressive things happened there. And I'm not an engineer, so I can't explain this really adequately, but the testing was static firing in that there are these huge test stands, and the engines were held in place by these test stands, and so basically a lot of rocket fuel and trichloroethylene poured down these huge buckets and down into the water system, into the soil and water. Area 4, which is the smallest area, it was set aside for some of the earliest experiments in commercialized nuclear power. Later on, Area 4 would be used for laser research for the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as the Star Wars program. So the research that was going on in Area 4 was all part of an effort post-World War II to foster and control the peacetime development of atomic science and technology. So on January 1st, 1947, the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission took over from the Manhattan Engineer District the massive research facilities built during World War II to develop the atomic bomb. Then in 1954, President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech, anybody remember that? Set forth the hope that the U.S. could use the ingenuity and capital of private enterprise to beat the sword of nuclear weapons into the plowshares of nuclear-generated electricity, maybe even into a utopian future fueled by safe, clean electricity too cheap to meter, according to Atomic Energy Commission Chairman Lewis Strauss. The Atoms for Peace initiative called for 5 reactors in 5 years to test out the most promising designs for commercial uses. Atomics International, based in Los Angeles, received one of those 5 contracts. Its president was a man named Chauncey Starr, a pioneer in the fields of nuclear energy and risk analysis, and an evangelist for the idea of electrification as a boon to humankind. So Atomics International won one of those contracts for its sodium reactor experiment. And I'm not going to get into the details of that, but it used liquid sodium as a coolant instead of water. So I don't know if any of you have a chemistry background here, but liquid sodium is very volatile stuff, so it has to be handled extremely carefully. In April 1955, construction began. The first controlled nuclear fission began on April 25th, 1957. On July 12th, 1957, the sodium reactor briefly provided electricity for the nearby town of Moorpark. So this was a publicity effort to show that yes, we can do this, and it did supply some power to Moorpark for a while. But then came Run 14. So many disasters have a definitive timestamp. JFK was shot at 12:30 p.m. on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. 3 Mile Island's Unit 2 reactor began to fail at 4 a.m. on March 28, 1979. The Challenger broke apart exactly, apparently, 73 seconds into its flight. The exact time and date of the partial meltdown of the SRE, on the other hand, is still somewhat murky. It seems fair to say that the disaster unfolded over a period of 2 weeks, from July 12th through 26th, 1959. And at several points along the way, it could have turned out very differently. We do know that within hours of beginning Run 14, reactor room monitors showed a sharp increase in radioactivity, according to a longtime activist named Daniel Hirsch. A coolant disruption and fuel damage caused a power excursion. The power went for a vacation. In which reactor power goes up exponentially in an uncontrolled and fast fashion. If the exponential period is very short, the reactor can blow up, as happened at the SL1 reactor in Idaho and the Chernobyl reactor in Ukraine. At the SRE, the operators tried desperately to shut the reactor down, but the power was still rising as they jammed the control rods into the core, which manually scrammed or shut down the reactor. In an alternate universe, that might have been the end of it. The reactor might have been shut down and not run again until the cause of the power excursion had been fully identified and repaired. But instead, Daniel Hirsch says, the inexplicable happened. Unable to determine the cause of the power excursion, and faced with rising radiation readings, just a couple of hours later, they started the reactor up again and kept it running for another 2 weeks. Radiation monitors kept going off scale. The radioactive gas was repeatedly purged from the reactor vessel, pumped into tanks outside the reactor, and released into the atmosphere. And to this day, they deny that this happened, that there was any kind of release into the atmosphere. No one knows precisely how much radioactivity was released, because the first sample of the core cover gas was so intensely radioactive, it was unsafe for any worker to approach it, to even measure it. So what do you do when the unthinkable happens and just about nobody saw it happen? Well, sometimes you wait 5 weeks and then send out an extraordinarily misleading press release. The news release from the Atomic Energy Commission, embargoed for a Saturday morning, August 29, 1959, stated only that during an inspection, a parted fuel rod had been observed, but that the fuel element damage was not an indication of unsafe reactor conditions. No release of radioactive materials to the plant or its environs occurred, and operating personnel were not exposed to harmful conditions. A parted fuel had indeed been observed, but so had 12 others, which is fully 1/3 of the core that melted down. And was observed does not convey what John Pace, who was a 19-year-old reactor trainee at the time, encountered when he arrived for his graveyard shift about a half hour after the meltdown had begun. He found his co-workers, quote, white around the gills and working furiously to shut the reactor down. He recalls someone thrusting a roll of duct tape at him and telling him to seal off the door between the control room and the reactor, and all of the doorways leading from the control room to nearby offices. In the last minutes and seconds, he recalls, the only thing they had left to do was let all the radiation out of the reactor in the hope it would shut down. It went straight out over the east end of Simi Valley and the entire San Fernando Valley. All these men lived in the west end of San Fernando Valley, and it went right over their homes. It went right over their families and their children. The workers were told to say nothing. Atomics International would take care of informing the public. Out of a loyalty to his company that is hard to fathom today, John Pace kept the secret for the next 50 years. His reluctance to speak out began to wane in 2009 when he finally saw a TV documentary about the little-known partial meltdown. Pace actually watched himself working on the reactor in some vintage film recorded for training purposes in fall 1959. It's sort of a reenactment of it. It's a very calm film. It just shows, how they very calmly, fixed the reactor. It wasn't true, but he saw himself. So it shows him helping with the physical inspection of the reactor, including pulling out damaged fuel rods. Not one of the workers wear anything like hazmat suits. Their cotton caps, like Burger King hats, bear the message, "Your safety is our business." In a 2009 press conference, Pace, who was 70 at the time, addressed reporters' questions. In the interview, his speech is slow and deliberate, with a laconic Western drawl. He wears a red flannel shirt. A lot of it was you didn't want to lose your job. You're working for Atomics International and making not too bad money for the time. If the reactor is gone, nobody's got work. Besides the pressure from the top echelon, the workers did what they were supposed to do. They didn't want to lose their jobs either. His voice breaks slightly. He turns his face from the camera. Just give me a minute. He resumes. It's a cleansing feeling to get it out of you and to be able to speak about it. It relieves a lot of pressure, but it's a scary thing also. In 1966, Chauncey Starr accepted a position at UCLA as Dean of its School of Engineering and Applied Science. He brought with him numerous Atomics International documents, which remained archived in a little visited part of the engineering laboratory, undisturbed until 1979. And that was actually right after the 3 Mile Island accident. And some UCLA grad students, I guess, wanted to see if anything similar might have happened in Southern California. And long story short, they stumbled upon this archive, which has, the true account of what happened. It shows photos of the melted fuel rods and so on and so forth. In 1969, while he was still at UCLA, Starr wrote a landmark paper in the field of risk analysis, social benefits versus technological risk. In this highly cited paper, Starr explored the question of how safe is safe enough by evaluating risks and benefits from widely accepted technologies. Starr observed that much larger risks are accepted when they are taken voluntarily, in contrast to those that are involuntary. As Starr famously put it, we are loath to let others do to us what we happily do to ourselves, meaning we worry more about certain dangers than we do driving too fast down the highway. He's certainly got a point there. So in a 2000 video, recording of a birthday party for Starr, he fields questions from many distinguished guests. He has just turned 95, has a Solzhenitsyn-style chin curtain beard, and shows absolutely no signs of cognitive decline. But nobody asked him why the 1959 accident had been so thoroughly covered up. Why the risks of living downhill, downwind, and downstream of a nuclear accident for residents of Simi and San Fernando valleys remained unknown, and thus involuntary, of course, for 20 years. Nobody asked him what sorts of conversations happened in the executive offices of Atomics International in the 5 weeks between July 13th and the brief, intentionally misleading press release issued 5 weeks later. I would love to know what happened, what was said in those mahogany row offices, how they discussed it, how they decided, what to do with this information. But I can't say that he was a bad man. What I can say is that he was a brilliant nuclear engineer. He was also involved in enriching uranium for the Little Boy bomb that was dropped.
Was he the person who came up with the original idea of the sodium?
That was somebody else, and I can't remember his name, but it was somebody else who was working on the Manhattan Project. I think they were out in California at the time. Livermore?
He was probably a very senior member of the team.
Yes.
That was under pressure to come up with the innovation.
Yeah.
It happens.
Yes. So Starr was he was the pragmatic person who knew how to translate ideas into, this machine that would use.
Went along with the original idea that was proposed by somebody very senior, I predict.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what else. Anyway, he was completely a utilitarian because he was such an evangelist for the idea of fully electrifying the United States. This is fairly new back then. We take it for granted now, but that was such a great good that it was worth risking some collateral damage. Just one note about the sodium, the liquid sodium, seemed like a very promising technology. Levon, you can help me out with this a little bit because...
well, the problem is that the sodium would solidify if the temperature went down to the predicted operating temperatures.
Yes.
And so it would be useless.
Yes. And I think, again, I was trying not to get too technical because I don't understand it all, but it was a tetralin leak, and tetralin is some kind of an organic substance that was in the coolant channels to keep something away from something, and the tetralin clogged. Right. And that sort of, disabled the cooling system. So basically that was what happened. But it seemed like a very promising technology because sodium could cool much more efficiently than water. And back in the 50s, they were worried about the supply of uranium running low. They also believed that using sodium instead of water would mean, because it operated at a lower pressure, that you wouldn't need a containment structure because it wasn't going to have an accident. And incidentally, that's why this accident, even though it was just a little rinky-dink, I forget how many kilowatts it was operating on, why it was actually much worse in terms of the release to the environment than 3 Mile Island, was because it didn't have a containment structure. So TMI did, this one didn't, so there was nowhere for it to go but out. And so I definitely understand why electricity from nuclear power has been such an attractive possibility for so many decades. Even back in the 50s, they knew that our fossil fuel reserves were finite and that our energy needs would continue to increase. And I'm sure many of you know that there's a new push to get slightly different, maybe smaller reactors online so that we can use more nuclear power to augment other types of power. So I definitely understand it, I get it. I'm actually not anti-nuclear per se. I'm anti the carelessness and the cover-ups and the fact that not enough attention from the beginning has been paid to safety, because there's such a rush to let's get this thing going that you don't see much about safety, about how to deal with the waste and such. But this is what I can argue with complete confidence, is that covering up that early accident, and not just the event itself, but the cover-up of the event. You know, when you lie, you have to cover it up, and then you have to cover up the cover-up, and it sort of continues to the present. So before going ahead with a new generation of nuclear reactors, it does seem very likely this is going to happen in the near future. And I think, isn't Bill Gates's idea to use sodium reactors again? It's being revived anyway. So we need to confront the failures and the cover-ups of the past. At the very least, the secrecy left no room for letting people know what they had been exposed to. It took from them the possibility of making an informed choice about where they would work and where they and their children would live. During those 20 years, the population of the cities closest to the lab, Simi Valley, Canoga Park, West Hills, Woodland Hills, nearly doubled. The number of new housing units nearly doubled as well. So now, the valleys used to be fairly sparsely populated. They were primarily agricultural, but now I think there are nearly 500,000 people living within a few miles of the lab. And housing prices, of course, have risen so steeply that it's all but inevitable that land will continue to be developed closer and closer to the site, not just of a nuclear meltdown, but many other accidents and mishandling of materials as well. So I gave you another sheet just because this is sort of complicated information, and I thought you might like to follow along with me. But these bullet points are what nearly everyone, and that includes the 3 entities now responsible for the site, the Boeing Company primarily, NASA, and the U.S. Department of Energy, can agree on, or at least mostly agree on. That between 1949 and 2006, and I've corrected the figure I think that you have, some 30,000 rocket engine tests were conducted in areas 1, 2, and 3. Among other contaminants, about 500,000 gallons of the solvent trichloroethylene, known as TCE and sometimes trike, has contaminated the groundwater. That, along with the sodium reactor experiment, Area 4 housed 9 other experimental reactors, several of which had similar accidents, along with numerous critical facilities, which are very small reactors that help develop nuclear science and applications. There are currently over 300 documented contaminants of concern remaining in the SSFL soil, surface water, and groundwater. The most concerning include the radionuclides cesium-137, plutonium-239, strontium-90, tritium, and the chemical contaminants TCE and perchlorate being a rocket fuel. SSFL is one of the most contaminated sites in the country, and it's currently a Superfund site. Also, a federally funded 2000 study found a 60% higher rate of certain cancers for those living within 2 miles of the site, as opposed to those living further away. 1,500 former Rocketdyne and Atomics International workers have received federal compensation for their cancers. The breast cancer mapping project has shown that the communities surrounding SSFL have invasive breast cancer rates 10 to 20% higher than the state average. And here's the one that just really kills me. The Boeing Company, the U.S. Department of Energy, and NASA reached agreements with the state of California in 2007 and 2010, binding them to restore the site to background standards. And that according to these legally binding agreements, the site cleanup was supposed to have been completed by 2017. And in 2018, that was the year that the Woolsey fires, one of these California wildfires, and it was named the Woolsey Fire because it traveled down the canyon right adjacent to the lab. It burned 80% of the lab and nearly 100,000 acres of adjacent land in Ventura and Los Angeles counties, carrying contaminants far off-site. And the cleanup at that point had barely begun. And I haven't even mentioned yet what originally drew me into this subject and which continues to drive my obsession with it. And that's the high incidence of rare childhood cancers in the communities surrounding the lab. Collateral damage often has faces, and too many of these faces are very young ones. There's so much more to say here, but I'm going to give the last word to Melissa Bumstead, a young mother who lives in West Hills, California, who became an accidental and actually very reluctant activist when her then 4-year-old daughter, Grace, was diagnosed with leukemia. Melissa and her family lived just a few miles away from the lab. I was privileged to meet with her the most recent time I flew back to visit with my sister in California. She's a fellow Christian, and it was wonderful to be able to connect with her on that level. I've been struggling and continue to struggle. As I said, this book is an ongoing project with the problem of evil, with how evil things happen, how sort of bureaucratic mistakes can unleash great evil. And of course, she had been struggling with the same sorts of questions, but on an intensely personal level. I have to note here the central role of mothers. So many of the activists are mothers, not all of them with children who've been affected, but you don't come between a mama bear and her cub. And mothers are a big deal and a big driving force in this fight against this issue. Oh, and they, I guess Melissa told me, just to interject this, that they could have gotten a settlement, but they don't want a settlement, they want to clean up. So, many other people have gotten settlements, but it also comes with non-disclosure agreements, so they continue. So I'm going to leave you just with a bit of her story, as told in one of her blog posts. So Melissa writes, I first heard of the Santa Susana Field Lab when Grace was diagnosed with Ph-positive lymphocytic leukemia in early 2014. She was 4 years old and spent months in the hospital. This first time that she had cancer, she also relapsed. A family member sent me paperwork on the lab. I didn't read the headline didn't read past the headline before throwing the article in the trash. We live less than 5 miles from the site. To think that I somehow contributed to Grace getting cancer by living near a toxic site was too painful. So painful that I was not able to deal with it at the time. 6 months after Grace was diagnosed, she and I were walking the halls at Children's Hospital during an inpatient stay. A mom opened her door and stuck her head out. I know you two, she said. You and your kids were at the park before my daughter was diagnosed. I recognized your daughter because she was bald. My daughter has neuroblastoma now. My son has eye brain cancer, another mom said when she was commenting on the childhood cancer awareness decorations on our car. I asked where they lived. It turned out they lived on my street. I'm sorry, but that's impossible, I said. Childhood cancer is really rare. I don't think it's possible that we could live so close to each other. I met a different mom in the oncology clinic where both of our girls were getting chemo that day. During our conversation, I realized she lived over the hill in Simi Valley. We're probably a few miles away as the bird flies, Lauren said. I didn't like the sound of that, but I was still in denial and just accepted it as chance. During that year in denial, I had been going to counseling, and I had started Celebrate Recovery at a local church, which is a 12-step program of some sort. Step 1, I had to admit that I am powerless, and somehow this gave me freedom to let God heal my hurts, knowing that He is in control, and I am not. I started to learn to trust people again, and to work through fear instead of running away. I learned that I can be used by God even when I'm utterly broken, powerless, and small. I decided that denial was just as painful as it would be to do something to help, to get involved. So I started reaching out to other cancer patients I knew. They helped me find more kids in our community with cancer. Every time I added a child to the cancer map, I have to take time after to grieve. Every time. It was like Grace being diagnosed all over again. The emotional pain has not lessened, and I don't think it ever will. Still, I will continue to seek out the truth. I found children with absurdly rare cancers, all within 20 miles of the SSFL. And I mean absurdly rare, even in the rare world of childhood cancer. For example, Ewing sarcoma has about 200 cases a year. 200 out of nearly 74 million children in America. We had 2 teens from the same high school the same year diagnosed with that extremely rare disease last year. The PTSD rips open the wounds every single time I think I'm getting better. And every single time I'm back at the beginning again. I feel like it's the day Grace relapsed. She did relapse. It takes like 1 or 2 cells to cause a relapse of cancer. It was just heartbreaking. She had a bone marrow transplant, survived, and she's now a happy, healthy 14-year-old. So that's the end of the story. But every time it was like Grace being diagnosed all over again. The emotional pain has not lessened, and I don't think it ever will. Still, I will continue to seek out the truth. Oh, I think I just read that. I'm sorry. I lost my place. I've also watched the good God is bringing out of her cancer. I feel so conflicted some days, I think I'll implode. But also is an important word for me, a word I hold on to as if it were life support. God allowed Grace to get cancer. Also, He is using her cancer to protect others. My faith in God was completely devastated. Also, I continue to trust Him. I am broken. Also, I am healing. I hate Grace's cancer so much that I want to burn the world down. Also, I'm grateful for the good things God has allowed to come from it. Again, it seems so simple on paper, but it's been a nightmare living in my brain lately. My faith and my emotions have been ricocheting from one extreme to the other until I think I'll lose my mind. It's been exhausting. But there's calm in also. It's a place of rest where my extremes can coexist. It's where I don't have to make sense. And that seems to be where God keeps leading me back to. The place where I find Him waiting for me, the place where He understands me when I don't understand anything. Thank you, Melissa. So, questions, comments? Posey.
What are your thoughts about the move to restart the Mile Island?
Oh, I just heard about that, yeah. I know I can't comment on it very knowledgeably, but I hope that they've thought through the safety issues. I would love to know what they've done to ensure that the same kind of accident doesn't happen
So
again.
close to home.
Yeah. Phil.
So, Patty, is your book primarily about the story of the decision-making in July and August of 1959, or is it more about the ramifications of that failed decision-making?
Yeah, part B, yes, because I'm actually still kind of stuck in the Cold War, still trying to unpack what, where this came from, what kind of atmosphere were they making decisions in. And again, it was 20 years before anybody outside a very small circle of people knew about it. But the history of it is just so depressing because there have been revelations and documentaries, and Boeing is pushing back really, really hard with their own experts, and so there have been cover-ups, and they will admit that the site is heavily contaminated, but they try to tell you that none of it moves off-site. This is actually, it's at the top of a mountain. It's at the top of a watershed recharge zone. So one watershed goes towards where I grew up, and the other one goes towards the Los Angeles River. But they sort of found some scientists to argue that the soil there is an aquitard, meaning it sort of holds everything in and nothing can leave the site. But there's plenty of evidence of contaminants leaving the site.
So your book won't be mostly about the damage done by the many sins of this. It'll be primarily about the cover-up after the events of the summer of '59.
It will be. I'm going to try to cover it all, but interspersing it. One part I didn't. I was going to try to read here was me hiking up to the lab boundary and climbing up on a rock and looking down into the remains of the lab, so it's sort of partly me exploring these places and meeting people, but interspersed with the history up to the present. Amy. Oh.
Yeah. Two ends of it. Of one, it makes me worry, well, because I already am, about how much other in our lives in day-to-day is a farce and it's just being covered up, and the news and governments and big media are just telling us what they want to choose. But I'm also wondering, do you think that could actually happen again today between people not having that kind of loyalty to their employer, as well as we all have these magic pieces of glass that can video everything? Like, I'm just wondering, do you think that kind of a cover-up could actually happen in today's society?
Well, fortunately, I think it would be less likely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was a massive event, but people felt differently. They trusted the government more. So I hope not. One worry with a whole lot of smaller reactors is that they can be terrorism targets and so on. So, Gail.
Maybe you addressed this, but as of as of today, is there any desire for them to keep on cleaning this place up? I mean, is there?
Well, it's kind of like Bill Clinton saying it depends upon the meaning of the word is. Depends upon what is, because there's been a lot of redefinition of terms, so that they're proposing to clean up very small amounts of the pollution, and so that's what legal battles are all about right now.
So there is some, as of 2024, there is still some.
There's some slight cleanup, yes, some small cleanups, but I think that restoring a site to background means you get rid of everything that was left there by humans, or at least humans post World War II. But they've come up with what they call a risk-based assessment of the contaminants, which means that they can decide what to clean up and what not to clean up. There's all kinds of horrible things going on here that would never, and to your point, would probably not happen today. They would take barrels of the used sodium, which again is highly toxic, and shoot at them with rifles to release the toxic stuff. So there's this something called the sodium burn pit, which is heavily contaminated, and then there's another burn pit where various things were just burned in the open air, and they are cleaning that up. So, but it's only part of it. Dean.
I mean, it's not a heard you, but what got you personally into this concern?
It was very unexpected. I think that I was just stumbling around maybe Facebook. I scroll Facebook a lot, I hate to admit. But I stumbled upon probably the Parents Against Santa Susana Field Lab disaster and met some of the parents there. And I was absolutely gobsmacked that this had happened just really 20 miles away from where I'd grown up, and I had never heard anything about it whatsoever until a few years ago. So that, and because so much of it involves children, I'm a mom, I'm a grandmom, so I'm also a writer, and it was a good story. It's still fairly unknown, so I guess that's how it happened.
Well, life is the best disinfectant, right? So life is the best disinfectant.
Amen.
You're gonna tell
Amen.
us, you're gonna tell everybody about it. Thank
Yes.
you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, so much of it came too late.
I know.
One response to this amazing story you told us, and I'm so grateful to you for
Yes,
that.
yes.
And one response might be, I'm embarrassed to say, I've had a little of this, schadenfreude. Boy, I'm glad I live where we live and not in California. And so having said I'm embarrassed to have that reaction, I also can't help but ask you the question, are there in fact things in any sense comparable to this that are within a couple of hours of where we all live? When we moved from Chicago in 1996, we heard repeatedly about the Salem coal-fired power plants and the prevailing winds from that being related, many people thought, I never saw the stats on this, to a higher rate of breast cancer among the women of Manchester, the community where we chose to live. And while on the one hand we carry around all these phones that can capture live video, we seem to, over the years since 1996, have gotten particularly bad at dispassionate analysis of statistics. And I have no idea whether there are things in this world that are worthy of more analysis with respect to things like childhood cancer
Yes.
and breast cancer and all these other things.
Apparently, there's very, very little research going on about childhood cancer compared to, say, breast cancer or prostate. Melissa told me the percentage of research that goes into this is minuscule. So definitely more research is needed on that. I just want to mention Woburn, Civil Action. Anybody see that?
Yeah.
And that was just totally, non-technological, really. It was byproducts from a tannery. So it wasn't nuclear, it wasn't rocket fuel, it wasn't, but it was just such a disheartening story because the standard, all these kids were getting cancer, but the standard of proof for declaring something a cancer cluster is really, really high. Really high. And I think probably higher than it should be. So, and Melissa will say too, you can never prove that a particular cancer was caused by a particular thing, but you can sure draw a lot of dotted lines to.
So would you draw any dotted lines in eastern Massachusetts?
I don't, let's see, Seabrook doesn't seem to have done anything horrible, and it's however many years it's been around. So I guess I can't answer that question. Anybody else have observations about that right in our backyard?
Well, they are kind of planning for it, because they had 4-lane highways south from Seabrook area.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that there are things happening that we don't know about.
Well, I don't think they're planning that it's going to happen, but they sort of, if it were to happen, they feel
So, you know, in some ways the situation is better because we know more and there are activists who will keep pushing. But in California in particular, the population has mushroomed and, you know, you always have to follow the money. This land is so valuable. In fact, in one of my hikes, I start at a housing subdivision called Arroyo Vista at the Woodlands, and it's sort of about how I hiked up a mountain biking trail. But the battle went on for years with respect to this housing subdivision, and it was finally built, you know, maybe 10 or 15 years after they first wanted to build there. Thank you so much, everybody.